But yeah,
I guess this is good enough. We're going to be writing on the blackboard. What do you think? You think it would be better?
Okay. So, for the rest of the afternoon, we're going to have, I think, a very interesting presentation on the Tenaya language. Dr. James Carey has been working on this language along with Peter Kalafonsky, Fedosia Sakaloff, and others for about 2 years, I guess. And they have developed a writing system for the language. This once dying language now can be considered to be preserved, mainly by the efforts of these people here. Dr. Carey.
Thank you, Val. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here today with two of my teachers. I first started my work here in Kenai very briefly in the spring of '72, and at that time, you can't hear us? At that time, how's that? At that time, I came up with my wife, and we camped in the area and met people. And at that time, I met Peter Kalafonsky and Fedosia Sakaloff and Bertha Munfer and the late F.M. Baktuit. And I did linguistic work with them for about 2 weeks. And then I was able to return in the fall of '73, well, in September of '73. And we've lived here in the area continuously since then. Like I said, it's a pleasure for me to appear with my teachers. One of them couldn't be here today. That's Mrs. Bertha Munfer. We're very sorry she couldn't be with us. She wanted to be here. Her thoughts are with you. But we're happy to know that she just got back from the hospital and is recovering nicely from an operation that she just had. I can't really begin to say enough about my teachers and how good they are for the kind of work that we've done and how patient and helpful and dedicated they've been to the work that we've been doing. I'm going to talk a little bit more through the course of this presentation about their specific ways they've helped and the kind of skills that they have for this kind of language work. Today I'm going to, what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a background on some of the research, the linguistic research that we have done, and then I'm going to talk about the practical work, the work that has to do with school programs and the teaching of the language. And through the course of the presentation, Fedosia is going to say some verbs for you. The Tenaya language has one of the most complicated verb systems of any language in the world, and we're going to show you a little bit of the complexity of that. She's going to explain or say some forms for you, and I'm going to write them down for you. And then later on in the presentation, Peter is going to read a story that he just wrote last week that I think you'll find interesting. I'd like you to ask questions as we go along. I tend to go fast and get absorbed in details, and sometimes it doesn't make for the best listening, and I'd like you to stop and slow me down and ask questions of either me or my two teachers here. And so please feel free to stop us and raise your hands. Okay, I want to begin by telling you a little bit about what we call Tenaya, or what's generally known as the Tenaya language, or Dena'ina. And I want to point some things out on the map. Well, before I turn the blackboard around, the name Tenaya that is in the anthropological literature is based on this word Dena'ina, and that's their name for people, or native people, which Morgan Sherwood referred to this morning in some of his research. It's a typical Athabascan word for people, and that's what the name Tenaya comes from. Let me turn this around. Can you hear me all right when I just stand here without a microphone? Can you hear me?
Just
No?
a little loud.
Maybe that one detaches here and I can hold it. Tenaya is an Athabascan language, and Athabascan is a family of about 50 languages.
Push the button up. Black one.
Athabascan is a family of about 50 languages. It's the most widespread language family in North America. What I mean by a family of languages is the same thing like we mean when we say Indo-European is a family of languages. That means that like Sanskrit and German are related languages at one time, historically. Athabascan is such a family of languages, and the Navajos and the Apaches in New Mexico speak a language that is very close, very similar to the language that these people speak here in Kenai. There's about 7 or 8 Athabascan languages in the southwestern part of the United States. In Oregon and California, there formerly were about 15 Athabascan languages. That's in Northern California, in Humboldt County, and slightly south of Humboldt County, and then on the coast of Oregon. Right now, there's probably about 5 or 6 people who still speak some of the, no, wait a minute now, I just lopped off 20. There's about 25 people who speak some of the Athabascan languages of California and Oregon, the most numerous of whom are the Hupa people. There's about 20 people who speak the Hupa language, and then there's about 5 people who speak a couple of the other Oregon Athabascan languages. And then all in northern Canada, in the Northwest Territories, through the northern half of British Columbia, northern half of Alberta, and into Saskatchewan, people, and in the Yukon, the native languages of the area are Athabascan. And then in the interior of Alaska, the languages are Athabascan. Athabascan is a very conservative, very homogeneous language family. All the languages are very similar, and they're very obviously related. They're very closely related languages, and they have a reputation for complexity, a notorious reputation for complexity, which is the main reason why I like to study them. They're a lot of fun. Now, let me talk a little bit about where the Dena'ina language is, and also a little bit about the Alaska Native Language Map and the neighbors of the Dena'ina people. Right now, there are about 200 speakers of the Dena'ina language. The language formerly was in Seldovia. Well, there are 2 people in Seldovia who are marginal speakers of the language, but there's no real good speaker of the Seldovia dialect except possibly one woman who lives in Seattle. And then on this side of the Kenai Peninsula in Kenai, and formerly whatever the village makeup was on this side of the village, this was all Tenaya territory. And then up behind Anchorage, up is probably around Talkeetna area, and up the Susitna River was the boundary up this way, and then up toward in the Matanuska Valley, probably, well, at least probably in the Palmer area, but not as far as Eska Creek. Eska Creek and further inland from there seems to be the Otna language. There's a language boundary there in the Matanuska Valley, and then in coming on this side of the inlet, well, that includes Eklutna and Kinnick and Susitna, formerly when Susitna was an inhabited village, all Tenaya speaking. And then I don't really know what the village makeup was up above there, but there's some Tenaya speakers, presumably from the Talkeetna area. And then Tyonik and formerly Kuskotan, which in the old Tenaya village. And then down on the shore of Cook Inlet here, down as far as Iliamna Bay, presumably. And then up here on Iliamna Lake, there were a number of villages. Pedro Bay is where the main home is of the Tenaya people, the Dena'ina people who still live in Iliamna Lake. And then Mundalton is a Dena'ina village. And then Lime Village, which is up on the Upper Stony River, where over here is another Dena'ina village. So you would draw the map, the language map for the people like this, like that. And by the way, there is a new map of Alaska Native languages that's coming out from the Alaska Native Language Center in Fairbanks, and which has the linguistic boundaries drawn on them. Now, how do we say this is a language and that Atna over here is a separate language, and in Gaelic over here and this side is a separate language? Yeah?
What would you use that yardstick instead of
Yeah.
people on this side can't see?
Okay, yeah. Okay, the language boundary would run from Seldovia up above Anchorage to roughly around Talkeetna, and then at some point like this, cutting back toward the Upper Stony River where Lime Village is, and then down through this northern half of Lake Iliamna. What we mean by saying that that is a language is that can be defined by certain properties. You can just count certain traits that they have in common and see the common patterns in the grammar of the language and in the vocabulary of the language that the other languages to them, neighboring them, just don't share. And then those languages in themselves form a cluster of dialects and share their own separate traits for those same things. The language to the west is, they call Ingalic in this area, in the Kuskokwim and part of the lower Yukon River. And then the language in this area from Cantwell and then down Copper River, and then, like I said, and then down as far east as Mentasta, and then down toward Chitina, and then down toward the Matanuska Valley is what they call Atna, the Copper River people, and the Atna language. There are about 10 Athabascan languages in Alaska. That includes some of the people up here in this area. Well, you've probably seen the maps before of the linguistic boundaries. They run something like this for Athabascan territory. And then within that area, there are 10 different languages.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Are they completely different languages, or just one major language with each language having their different little quirks?
Well, I'm calling them different languages, and then within those languages there are dialects. Within the Tenaya language, like I'm going to mention, there are 3 main dialects. And so these are language boundaries. They're a family of languages. Athabascan, this would be like comparing something like, say, many of them are much further apart than, say, Spanish and French. Like the difference between Tenaya and Cochin is more like, say, the difference between Spanish and English. It's a major, the people cannot understand each other. And generally the boundaries are drawn on intelligibility, and whether people can understand each other across the boundaries. And I've done some research on the boundaries here between Atna and Tenaya and between Ingalic and Tenaya, studying those questions of intelligibility across the language boundaries. And we really call these separate languages, and then within the languages we have dialects. The interesting thing about Athabascan languages in Alaska is every village had its own way of speaking, and they're very remarkable localization of the languages. It's very remarkable. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that when I talk about some of the dialect work that we've done. Now, on the numbers of speakers, in Seldovia I said there's 2 marginal speakers and maybe 1 or 2 others. In Kenai, we have 4 good speakers and maybe another 10 or 12 people who understand quite a bit of the language. You could call them marginal speakers. There are another 8 or 10 people who speak the Kenai dialect who live in Anchorage or Tyonek. In Eklutna and in the Upper Inlet area, there are 7 speakers. In Tyonek, there are around 25 speakers, maybe a few more than that. In Pedro Bay area there are 12 speakers. In Ndalton there are 60 or more speakers, maybe 60 to 70 speakers. In Lime Village there are about almost 30 speakers. Now the ages of the speakers is sort of like this. The two marginal speakers in Seldovia are age 52 and 62, and I think the last really expert Seldovia Dena'ina speakers died in the mid-50s. In Kenai, the speakers are over the age of 53. In Eklutna, there are a few speakers in their 50s. I don't know if there's anybody in their 40s who speaks the language. In Tyonek, there are some speakers as in their 40s, but they aren't really too good speakers. The good speakers in Tyonek are over the age of 50. In Pedro Bay, the youngest good speaker is 48 years old. In Ndalton, the language is more strongly preserved, and there are some speakers as young as 25 years old. And in Lime Village, I'm happy to report there are some children who speak the language, and I just determined that a little earlier this fall when I went over there, and I'm very, very happy about that. There's some kids, there's one boy who's about 12 years old, and he can really speak very well. He can speak the language well. And there's kids there, most of the school kids can understand the language, but they are dominant in English. They're better speakers of English than of Dena'ina. And, but that is the stronghold of the Dena'ina language, is Lime Village, population 38. And those kids there are the only children in the world who know this language right now. So let me sit down again and are there any questions right now? All right. Are there any questions on anything I've said so far? Like I said, the language has a reputation for being very complicated, and one of the things that indicates this is the fact that hardly anyone ever learns it beyond childhood. In fact, it's almost, I don't know if it has been learned beyond someone having grown up in the language. The two areas where they were in contact with Eskimo languages, and I didn't point that out on the map, but English Bay, Port Graham area, the people speak Chugach Eskimo or Sufsutun Aleut, they call that language, and that's an Eskimo language. And then the other area where they came in contact with speakers of another language was in Lake Iliamna area, and in the southern and western parts of Lake Iliamna. Now, in both of those areas, Athabascan speakers would learn the Eskimo language, like in an intermarriage or something like that, but never was the reverse true. Almost never, or even never. I don't know of any cases where the Eskimo speakers learned Athabascan, and that's a very interesting fact. Oh yeah, I neglected to mention that there are 5 Tenaya speakers in Stony River, too. You know where the village of Stony River is on the Kuskokwim. And that's a very interesting community. It's a quadrilingual community with 2 Athabascan languages spoken there by about 8 people. And 8 people speak 2 Athabascan languages. And then Eskimo is the dominant native language. Yupik Eskimo is the dominant native language of the community. And then English, of course, is now the first language of the children. And in that community is very interesting with all the, the mix of languages. The same pattern holds true too. The Athabascans learn Eskimo. For example, one woman I'm thinking of was married to an Eskimo. She speaks fluent Eskimo. Her kids learn Eskimo, and they don't learn Athabascan, and then in other cases of intermarriage, or for example, her husband did not learn Athabascan. And this seems to be the pattern throughout the state when Athabascan and Eskimo came in contact. And I think it also, it very clearly reflects the very difficulty of learning the language, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes when Fedosia says some verbs for you. Also, another thing that I think indicates the difficulty of the language is the lack of Russian liturgical materials in the Russian Orthodox Church that were translated into the language. There's nothing that we can find that they did, songs or prayers or things that were translated. Maybe something will turn up, but we have no record of this as opposed to the some quite extensive work that was done in Aleut and Yupik Eskimo and Chugach Eskimo and in Tlingit too, which is also a complicated language. But there's a lack of religious materials in this language, even though the church was here for a long time. Okay, I'd like to talk now about some of the work that we've done in the research aspect of our work. There were a number of vocabularies gathered in Kenai in the 19th century, actually more than you find for a lot of American Indian languages. There were a number of these are collected in Schiefner, 1874, which was published in St. Petersburg, and by oversight I forgot to put that in the bibliography in the book that you have. I can write the footnote up for you. You'll never find it though. It's I think it's in Peabody Museum in Harvard. You never find the thing, but I have a Xerox of it. It was written in German and published in Russia. But that collected a number of the early vocabularies that were gathered in Kenai, including the Rezanoff vocabulary of over 1,000 words, which was gathered in 1805. And then this whole thing by Schiefner was translated in English by Pinart sometime in the 1870s or so, and that manuscript is at Yale, which is English and French translations of the German manuscript. And then there was a very interesting vocabulary by Staffiev and Petrov gathered here in Kenai in 1885. That's the same Ivan Petrov that Morgan Sherwood was talking about this morning. And this is a pretty interesting vocabulary, rather extensive. There must be over 1,000 items in that too. And then the only thing ever printed in the language in this century was the Osgood, the vocabulary in the back of the Osgood's ethnography of the Tenaya. Now, all of these vocabularies were not written accurately. None of them were written accurately, but we can reconstruct those and we can learn to read those back, and we do a re-elicitation of those. I go over those part of the time in my work with Fedosia and Bertha and Peter. I've been reading back those words, and we come up with a lot of archaic vocabulary that way. Not finished with this by a long shot, but we come up with quite a bit from using those old vocabularies, and they do help fill in the linguistic picture. So that was one project that we've been working on. I've done a lot of, actually spent most of my time on grammatical studies of the language, and first thing I did was work on the sound system and the phonetics of the language in connection with developing an alphabet for the language, a practical alphabet for teaching, for use in teaching the language. And I was doing that in the fall of last year, a year ago, and with Dr. Mike Krause and myself, we came up with the final versions of the alphabet last fall in November or so, of a year ago. Then I've done studies of aspects of the grammar of Tenaya, a few of which I've written up, but not much that I've written up. Most of it's in my notes. I have a slip file dictionary on little 4x6 slips of paper, and they call that a stem list. And I make a collection of all of the parts of the words in the language. And whenever I hear a word that I haven't heard before, not just a word, but a portion of a word that I haven't heard before, I make an entry for it. And I put a lot of time into that. and it's just in pencil on these little slips. And then in my notes I've got a lot of information on the grammar and how words are put together and how sentences are put together. And I've done a lot of study on the verb in the language and the variations that the language undergoes, the variations that a single word undergo. I want to talk about this now, just briefly. The reason Athabascan is so complicated is because of the verb, and the verb has a stem in it, like a sort of a kernel meaning, and then it has all these prefix positions which go to the left of it or before the stem, and there are 13 positions in front of a stem, which makes it probably the most complicated single word complex of any language in the world. And a word like a verb, which we're going to demonstrate now, can be conjugated, it seems almost endlessly, but it's not endless, but there's hundreds of forms that some verbs can be put into. Any common ordinary verb can take about 60 forms, and these are single word variations within a single word. So most any old verb can have 60 forms, and then some of them, this can go into the hundreds. I haven't really calculated it. I know, over 200 forms you could do for some verbs. It's incredible. And the thing is, it's all entirely regular. It's all very regular, very patterned. It's just that the irregularities are so elaborate and so complicated to state. It just strikes you as a very ingenious, very, very graphic language, the way they put things together. Let me show you some things. Maybe Fidacia, here's a microphone here, and I'm going to go to the blackboard, and I'm going to write down some words that Fidacia says. Any questions? Yes. Pardon? Gee, you just reminded me of a whole thing I skipped. I'm glad very glad. See, that's why I want people to stop me here. Before we go into this, I skipped the dialect territories. And in fact, I just have to turn the blackboard around again. Okay. I'm really happy about that question, so somebody else ask me some questions in a few minutes. See what else I forgot. The part of my research has been on a dialect survey of Tenaya, and I've worked with speakers from all the Tenaya villages, or the Dena'ina villages. At this point, that's over 30 people that I've worked with, and I've pinned down what seem to be 3 dialect areas within the language. There's a dialect boundary that goes through Taionic and formerly Point Possession. There used to be a village in Point Possession, I understand. And then in the Upper Inlet area, I call that the Upper Inlet dialect. And then that's the major dialect difference within Dena'ina is from Taionic and in the Upper Inlet area. And then there's a minor dialect boundary between Kenai and Seldovia on the one hand, and then the inland Dena'inas from Iliamna and Dalton and Lime Village. So this dialect boundary between Taionic and for the Upper Inlet area is of more major consequence and makes that a little harder to understand. These 2 dialects here, what I call the Outer Inlet dialect, which I group Kuskotan too formally within this Outer Inlet dialect, Kuskotan, Seldovia, and Kenai as an Outer Inlet dialect. Those 3 villages, Kuskotan, Seldovia, and Kenai as an Outer Inlet dialect. And then Iliamna area, Pedro Bay mainly, and then Dalton and Lime Village as an inland dialect. And those two dialects are fairly close, but still defined by certain features. So those are the three dialects within the language. I want to talk a little more about that in a few minutes, about some of the implications of the dialect work for studying about Tenaya history. I don't have a great deal to say about it, but I'll make a few comments about it. Okay, back to where we were. I'd like to take a verb, and I should mention that, like I've mentioned how elaborate the verb is and how many forms you can have for a word, and Fidacia is absolutely the very best person I've ever worked with on this kind of material in a language. She's got remarkable analytical skills. She's so patient, the most patient person I've ever met, and is just very careful in pointing out my mistakes and correcting me and keeping very, just to the most minute detail, following through extremely strong analytical powers it takes, and she is so quick at it. She's as talented as as anybody I've ever seen, and I've heard other people make that comment too. Dr. Krause mentioned that when he met Fidacia last year, and he's worked with many speakers of Alaska Native languages, and he made the same comment. So let's take a verb to cut, like if we were going to say we're cutting fish, or like you use if you're cleaning fish, like astus. Do you know that one, Fidas? Yeah. Astus. Okay, say that for them. Just the last word, astus. Move a little closer in front of you toward the. Yeah. Just say astus. Astus. Now that's a present tense of a verb, which means I'm cutting it. And we write it like this. Astus. Now, let's do the tladu form.
Adostud.
Okay, did you hear the difference? Say the two for them, Fidas.
Adostud.
And then the first one again.
Astis.
Astus.
Oh, astus.
And then tladu form. Rastuts.
Adostud.
Okay, this is a past time form. I asked her to put the word yesterday in front of it to make it the past time, like I was cutting it yesterday. So this part of the word us here means some notion of cutting, and then the us is the I form, and also contains within it the notion of this present action and ongoing action of cutting. So I'm cutting it. And then I said, do the tladu form, which is the yesterday, past time form, and she puts this ra in front of it, which marks a past time, and then tuts, instead of tus, she says tuts, and that's a sign of the meaning part of the stem part of the word changing its time, in this characteristic change in the word. So it changes in two places, out here to the left in the prefixes, and then in the stem. This is the stem, and these are some of these 13 prefix positions that go on out here. Okay, you haven't seen anything yet. So, okay, nishkonda. Okay. I'm just saying a key word for her. This is how we often work. I'll say a key word, and she changes it. We're very efficient this way. She just rattles these off. And we're going very slowly at this time. We can streak through these. This is a dictionary entry. This is a more elaborate dictionary entry than I usually do, but this is an example of a dictionary entry for a verb. Okay, this is a future form where the T and the GH, marks a future meaning I will. And then the S again marks I am doing this. And then I just made a mistake. It's this word ends in an S. So this part of the word us here is like it was over here in the present form of the word, but the prefixes are changed again. There are three prefixes represented in this word. There's the S here for I, and then the ra and the t, which sort of combine to make the future. Then there's another way you can cut. I customarily cut like the nuitel kush form for us. Okay, that's a different one now. That's a customary form, like I cut, and that would appear in sentences like every summer I cut fish, astis, or you could say shantach shoka astis. I cut fish every summer. That's different than that I'm cutting it now, or that I did cut it, or that I will cut it. And this again is a single word change. This looks like this form, astus, except that the stem now has changed with this I in it. And then that has to do with a customary action. And then there's one more, let me cut it. Let me cut it. Yeah. And this is a special form, a special construction, like I'm going to cut it, or let me do it, lastusne. And again, now we get a different prefix complex. It looks something like this prefix complex in the past time, but it's really a little different than that too. And then there's a suffix on the end, ni, which is characteristic of this tense in the verb. Now these are all positive forms. I'm going to cut it. I neglected to mention, just for sake of clarity, that there's 5 other ways to do each one of these. There are 6 persons that appear in a verb, 6 actors, 6 possible subjects of a verb. Let's take astus for us and go through the ninku, yinku, nanaku, chaniku, and yinaku forms.
Astus.
And then ninku.
Ninku. And us.
Yinin.
Yininku yitus.
Yitus. Nanako.
Nanako. Chitus.
Chitus. Chaniku.
Chaniku. Achtus.
Achtus. And yinako.
Yinako chitus.
Chitus. Okay, I won't write all those for sake of space, but each one of these could be done in 6 different ways, changed by the prefixes. The actors, that's I'm cutting, you're cutting, we're cutting, he's cutting it, we're cutting it, you guys, you plural, are cutting it, and those guys are cutting it. Those are all separate single word variations. Now, on top of this, we have the negatives. They have separate single word negatives. Okay, I'm not cutting it. Okay, that's the negative of this. There we get, and this is sometimes said with a Z or a Y here, zistus or yistus. Here, the ending has changed from S to Z, and the prefix complex changes. Okay, I didn't cut it. Astis. Here we get tuts becomes tis, and then the us kind of looks like the us in the present time again. That means I didn't cut it in the past. I'm not going to cut it. As tras tus. Beautiful example of the increasing complexity of the language. The stem changes for the future, negative, tus to tus, and then there's a negative marker, an us put out here, and then still the future marker here, so that means I won't cut it. And then the negative of the customary translates something like I never cut it. Like I never cut fish. Shanta, kushta.
Kushta, yistis.
Yes, tis. And there again, the stem changes. The tis becomes tis, and then the prefix complex changes for a negative structure again. And then one more form that would be different would be don't cut it. usiku. This is a negative imperative. Don't do it. Usiku. Don't cut it. Usiku. Now, that's just if, okay, now all of these on the bottom, just like all these at the top, could be done 6 different forms. So that's 60 forms. And that's a verb for cutting fish. Now, if I were to be cutting wood, what happens if I'm cutting wood for us? Chika,
Tatus.
okay, or shiku chika dustus.
Chico chica tastus.
Okay, now if I happen, this astus was only if I'm cutting fish. If I'm cutting wood, you put a D out here. So if I'm cutting wood, all of this is multiplied over again with a D in it. For example, let me cut some wood is drastusni, right?
Tastusne.
So there's a D. Instead of rastusni, it becomes drastusni. Or if I'm not cutting wood right now. Kodukti kushta
Kushtak is tastus.
azdastus. So yastus is now azdastus for I'm not cutting wood. Well, like I said, Fedosia is the best person I've ever seen at just concentrating and sorting these out and being patient, and what she's contributed to the understanding of the grammar of her language is really, I think is really beautiful and of extreme importance for our study of Athabascan linguistics. And this also shows you why the Eskimos never learn Athabascan, and why nobody else does either. Yeah, it's beautiful. Are there particular questions right now? Yes?
Does the language provide for an expression of conditional clause, like when or if clause?
Yeah. Well, that restut is a perfect tense. It's a completed action. I cutted it. I cut it, you know. And, also, I should mention, you really haven't seen, you've only seen a portion of the complexity. There are 3 separate types of past tense. The la form, like the restuts in the center, middle, and the top, is one of the 3 past tense. No, there's 4. I forgot one. There's 4 types of ways of making past tense in the verbs. It's an unbelievable memory load to study if you were just to study this. I've worked with some of the Navajo teaching programs in the Southwest, and the progress people make in studying Navajo is abysmal, you know, and people are really motivated. It's a strong language, and a lot of people are interested. Of course, we don't have the best in the way of pedagogical materials, but the memory load that this represents is staggering. I also think that this is a factor in why the language is declining in number of speakers in a sense, because what you find is you can't be a bad speaker of Athabascan. If you are, your weaknesses as a speaker become so evident that you're discouraged in going on in it, and that's what you find in these communities where there is a mixture of, you know, the older generation speaks, and then maybe the middle-aged generation understands, and the younger generation, you know, doesn't know too much of the language. It sort of works that you're kind of discouraged in a way to improve, because it's so hard to handle it all, to remember it all. And it does accelerate language loss. And that's not true in Eskimo communities where there's such a thing as bad Eskimo being spoken, you know. Athabascan, when it's spoken, is the pure stuff, and you either learn it or you don't learn it, and you learn it when you're a kid. Some of this work is I'm pulling together in some publications and things, studies of this, but most of it it won't be printed or even typed up for a long time. And I'm still continuing the work. Now, going back on the dialect survey work, there are, like I said, these 3 regions of the Tenaya language. And I'm continually adding information to this all the time. I've added some since I wrote up the paper for your book here. And but there's one typo in that paper. I don't have it right here with me. Maybe I should point it out. In case some of you are interested in looking more at the particulars of dialect classification for this language, on page 36 of your book, see the next to the last paragraph, the last sentence in the next last paragraph says the Upper Inlet dialect contains a detailed discussion of the classification of Tenaya dialects. I don't know if anybody wondered about that sentence, but that should say that carry to appear A contains a detailed discussion of the classification of Tenaya dialects. And I'm referring you to the bibliography, and what I'm saying is that in this paper, in the bibliography, under my name, to appear A is a thing I wrote, a preliminary classification of Tenaya dialects, which will be, I think will probably be printed in the anthropological papers of the University of Alaska. And then I talk about dialect classification for this in more detail, and I list some of the particular things that you look at in dialect classification. I can't really go into too much detail right now, but what you find is shadings of differences throughout Cook Inlet. Speaking, you write like this. Kashnash, Kashnash. In Dalton, if you say that, it's like this. And I write this with an X. It's Kashnach, Kashnach. This is Kashnash. It ends in this SH sound in the Kenai area. But in Dalton, it's Kashnach. And in Upper Inlet area, the SH becomes more of an S, and it's kind of like this, Kasnas, Kasnas. So here you have the same word pronounced in 3 different ways throughout the Tenaya area. Kashnach, Kashnash, Kasnas. And so in the classification of dialects, we try and track down any number, like a couple of dozen properties like that of the language. What I find in there's some things of historical interest in this. I think the Upper Inlet Tenaya dialect, from Eklutna and Susitna in particular, is very strongly influenced by the Atna language, and many of the things which mark the Upper Inlet dialect are Atna types of features. There are some signs of Chugach Eskimo or Suksutun influence on the Kenai Seldovia language. It's very superficial, but you find some Eskimo words used for fish, certain marine animals and things, and you find a very interesting thing in, for example, in Peter and Fedosia's language. If you take a word like, how about Fedosia? Would you say, "I'm going to put my hat on"? Say that further. Well, here, say it right here. Say it again. Hear the whisper in that? And that's, Eskimo has whispered sounds. They have voiceless vowels. And she said, she whispers 2 of the vowels in that word. And that's an Eskimo language trait, and it's, most of the Tenaya dialects don't do it, or they don't do it so strongly, but here in Kenai, they have that whispered quality to the speech, which is very beautiful when you hear it spoken. And that's another sign of an Eskimo influence on the language. Yes? There are about 100 Russian loanwords in the language. I was going to mention that. It's hard to give a talk about something like this. It has so many sides to it, so many aspects. But let me come back to that in a minute on loanwords. There is a very superficial but nevertheless interesting little signs of some Eskimo influence on the outer inlet Tenaya dialect. I regard the inland Tenaya dialect of Lime Village and Dalton as the most conservative of the language. I think most of the other changes in the language are subsequent to the things that you find in those particular dialects, and I think that is going to be of some significance historically in study of the history of the Tenaya people. The Pedro Bay dialect in Lake Iliamna area is interesting because I basically group it with the inland Tenayanas of Nandalton and Lime Village, but it starts to shade a little bit like Kenai and Seldovia dialect. But it's basically an inland dialect, but it's got some transitional things that make it look a little bit like the Tenaya dialect spoken down here in Cook Inlet. In fact, their verb for speak, kashnash, is just like in Kenai and not like in Nandalton. But basically, it's more of an inland Tenaya dialect too. Lime Village is interesting because that village was established, I don't know exactly when, but in the early years of this century, and they used to live here in the map where it's Old Village on this Lake Telequana, which is further up the Stony River, which is closer to Cook Inlet. And then the Kijik area on Lake Clark, which was written up in the book by Van Stone and Townsend, is right here. And most of the Nandalton people, they say, came from Kijik, and there's a very close association of the Nandalton and Lime Village people. Their dialects are very alike in those two villages. They're just exactly alike to each other. I haven't found any differences at all. Basically, they're in most ways the most conservative. So I would, if I were to stick my neck out and say which area of the Tenaya area had the longest settlement of the early Tenaya speakers, would be somewhere in this upper Molchatna, upper Stony River area around there. There's no archaeological information to correlate with that. Van Stone and Townsend mentioned that they thought the Tenayanas of Pedro Bay, or of Kijik, maybe came up from the inlet, and because they had so many Russian goods that they found in the site, and they assumed that maybe they lived down here and then migrated inland. But I would, just on the linguistic evidence, I would say the reverse would be true. The possible Tenaya entry was somewhere over in this area. I don't have any way of dating that in any way. Are there any questions? Any of that? Let me see. This portion of the talk, I talked about some of the research aspects of my work, on the grammatical research and on the dialect classification. But equally important to me, and maybe more important actually, is work of a practical nature to make the language teachable and learnable, and to contribute to what I hope is going to be a Tenaya language movement. Let me give you a little background on the, there's a small little tradition of, there's a fairly strong tradition of American Indian linguistic research, which is gone on since the mid-19th century to study the native languages of North America. And in this century, there has developed a commitment toward the preservation of those languages and the perpetuation of those languages for the native speakers themselves. And what we see now, the bilingual education programs that we have in this state, are a product of that trend. And right now, this trend is the strongest that it's ever been throughout North America today. Just for perspective, for example, in the 1930s, during the Collier BIA administration, the Navajo language effort began, and the practical alphabet for Navajo was developed in the 1930s. Today there are Navajos in their 60s who've been writing their language most of their lives, and who have been teaching, working in school programs, and producing written materials in Navajo. So they have the most experience in this. The funding was for that dried up in the 50s, and the whole movement kind of lay dormant in Navajo and everywhere else in native language work in North America. And then in the late 60s, this got going again with the passage of the Bilingual Education Act, a federal act, and the Title VII funds, which were appropriated for bilingual programs. Now, these programs were originally set up for major languages like Spanish or Navajo, where children come to school and don't know English. They don't know the language of their teachers. And the main impetus for this legislation was to help the children to understand the dominant language in school. Now, as a result of that legislation, as a result of training teachers to learn to write Navajo and Eskimo, in developing of programs in those major native languages, the strong native languages, there's been some carryover now to these small languages like Tenaya with its 200 speakers. And people are getting interested in having language programs too. And now it isn't the case that the kids don't go to school not understanding their teacher. It's because they go to school and throughout life not understanding the language of their parents and not knowing that language. And so what we have now, and mostly in Alaska, Alaska being the prime example, are language preservation efforts, efforts at regenerating, revitalizing the language. And just really in the last few years, and Alaska has taken a lead in this with its state law and Bilingual Education Act for Alaska, which was, I'm not sure, Gary Holthouse was instrumental in the passage of that in, was it 72? 71. And I right now I can't tell you all the details of it, but Gary certainly could. But you passed a law that said that if you have a village with 15 kids who speak a native language, you're entitled to a teacher and the development of materials, training for that teacher in that language. Again, the law was favored toward the stronger languages. The requirement was that you had 15 kids who speak the language. But this started a strong movement for revitalizing Alaskan... Pardon? This started a strong movement for work in Alaskan Native languages. The Yupik Eskimos have taken the lead on this. They're the most numerous, and they have the most school programs now and the most experienced teachers and native linguists. And now we see the smaller Athabascan languages are starting up their own projects too. And we're now, at long last, the languages that are declining in number of speakers are beginning to develop a strong interest in the preservation of their language. Well, some of the work that we've done here is that is of a practical nature. Contributes to documentation of Tenaya culture and history. And in this regard, right now we've done over 25 stories in the native language. These include traditional stories, such as Peter's Ksa Suktu, which was the first thing printed in the language. This is the mouse story, printed by Alaska Native Language Center. And also we've done some narratives on the cultural, on the life of the people. These include, 11 of these will appear in a new reader called Dena'inat Kaitach, The Way the Dena'inas Are. And this contains stories by 11 different Dena'ina people. There's one by Fedosia about the first Russians, very nice little story. And there's one in there by Peter on beluga hunting. And then other stories in that book on various recipes told in the native language. And there's a very nice lazy, stupid nephew story, which is a sort of a grandmother's story, you know, the moral to it to get the lazy boy to working and to learning. And it'll be the first pan-dialectal material to appear in print in the language. It'll represent all 3 of the Tenaya dialects and 6 of the villages and 11 different people. And they're all short stories which will be useful in teaching reading in the future. Also, I'm working on a survey of Indian place names in Cook Inlet, and we've been recording songs and in some cases transcribing the words and writing out the words and translating the lyrics for the songs. We haven't taken that very far yet. I hope to go a lot further with that. Then we've done, I've done this Kenai Tenaya Noun Dictionary, which has 1,300 entries in it, and it's just for the Kenai dialect. I typed this up last spring around March or so, and it's already quite a bit out of date. We just mimeographed this, ran it off in a Ditto Master with 100 copies, and it's just considered a preliminary edition. We'll, I don't know when, but maybe by next summer or next fall, I want to do a revised version with including the dialect material from all 3 of the Dena'ina dialects in it, and it'll be probably maybe twice this length and be a lot more extensive, and we'll have time then to get some of the bugs out of this. But this is organized by subject matter, for example, animals, tools, numbers, colors, foods, transportation. And this shows a very interesting insight into the specialized lexicon, specialized vocabulary of the language. Got words for the different winds and different plants and things like that. And a lot of this, it takes a lot of time, and hope to carry this a lot further in the future. Of course, one of the main things we've done to contribute to the practical language effort was the development of the alphabet last year. And then last winter we, through the help of George Miller and the cooperation of Fedosia and Peter and Bertha, we set up an evening language class at Wildwood. And the class is still meeting weekly this year too, and it's open to the public, and anyone is welcome to come to the class. This year they're meeting over at Peter's apartment at Wildwood. What's your apartment? 32B?
32B, door B.
Yeah. All right, good.